In a village frozen in time, people vanished, leaving behind only golden masks, faces disappeared, names forgotten, and a chilling secret lingered beneath the snow. Tonight, you'll uncover the mystery that no one survived to tell. The story of the guilt procession begins long before anyone understood what the masks truly meant, long before the town of Hollow Creek realized that its most celebrated festival was nothing more than a ritual of disappearance, silence, and secrets buried beneath centuries of golden dust. In the autumn of 1823, when the leaves turned to a burnt orange and the air smelled of smoke and cold iron, a strange invitation arrived at every doorstep in the village. A single slip of parchment stamped with a seal no one recognized. Mask split down the center, half gold, half pitch black. Wisik. The note carried no instructions, no greetings, no signatures, only a line written in ink so dark it seemed to swallow the candlelight. Attend at midnight. See what was promised. Honor what was taken. The townspeople whispered about it for days, some dismissing it as an elaborate prank, others sensing something far older. Something the land itself had been waiting to remember. And when the clock struck 12 on the night of the harvest moon, the villagers gathered on the cobblestone square, shivering beneath flickering lanterns as a thin fog crawled between their ankles, like something alive. Moments later, a procession of 12 figures emerged from the darkness, each wearing a mask of pure hammered gold, sculpted with unsettling precision. No eye holes, no slits for breathing, no expressions carved onto the surface, just smooth, gleaming gold reflecting the firelight like blank suns. Their robes were deep crimson, embroidered with patterns shaped like twisting thorns. But what chilled the villagers most was not their silence or the eerie grace of their movements. It was how their feet never seemed to fully touch the ground. The masked figures glided rather than walked, drifting in perfect synchronization as if bound by a single, unseen pulse. The villagers, mesmerized and terrified, parted without a word as the procession moved through them, leaving a bitter metallic scent in the air. Children clutched their mothers, dogs whimpered and hid, and the elderly muttered prayers they had not spoken in decades. The figures never acknowledged anyone, never turned their heads, never paused, until they reached the old fountain at the center of the square. There, the tallest among them raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and the entire procession froze. The moment the figure's gloved fingertips touched the fountain's stone lip, every lantern in the square extinguished at once. Darkness, cold and absolute, swallowed everything. A chorus of gasps, screams, and frantic shuffling erupted from the villagers, but before anyone could flee, the lanterns reignited by themselves, one by one, circling the square like waking eyes. And that was when the villagers realized 12 of their own citizens were gone, vanished, replaced. Because the figures in the gold masks now stood in the exact positions where those 12 villagers had been standing moments before, matching their height, their posture, their stance. But beneath those golden masks, no faces. When the mayor, trembling violently, approached the nearest masked figure and reached out a hand, the mask tilted slightly downward as if acknowledging him. A tremor ran through the crowd, and then the figure raised both hands to its mask, slowly, ceremoniously, and began to lift. The villagers watched, breath frozen in their throats, expecting to see the face of their missing friend beneath. Instead, there was nothing. No skin, no flesh, no bone, no shape that could ever belong to a human being. Just darkness, depth, an impossible emptiness that seemed to pull the mayor's gaze inward. He staggered back in terror as the masked figure lowered the golden faceplate again, sealing the void. And before anyone could scream, before anyone could make sense of what they had witnessed, the 12 figures turned in unison and drifted back into the darkness, disappearing beyond the last lantern's flicker. The next morning, search parties combed the forest, the fields, the creek, but not a trace of the 12 missing villagers was ever found. Only their footprints remained, leading out of the square and stopping abruptly in the grass, as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Hollow Creek would never speak openly about that night again, but the question hung over the town like smoke for generations. Who wore the golden masks? And if those were not faces behind the masks, what were they wearing instead? In the weeks that followed the guilt procession, Hollow Creek behaved like a town, pretending not to be afraid, but its silence was louder than any scream could have been. Aim. Doors were bolted before sunset, windows shuttered even during daylight, and families whispered instead of speaking, terrified that any sound might summon the golden masked figures back into the square. The official explanation, drafted hastily by Meyer Whitlock, claimed the disappearances were the result of a kidnapping by unknown intruders. But no one believed that, not even the mayor himself. The disappearances left a void far deeper than 12 empty chairs at supper tables. They tore holes in the rhythm of daily life. Mrs. Hanover still set out her husband's boots every morning. Old Gregory counted 13 children at school instead of 12. And the blacksmith's dog refused to enter his workshop, barking at shadows as if something unseen still lingered there. But the worst signs were found by the sheriff when he inspected the homes of the missing. Every house had something out of place, something impossibly wrong. In Jonah Mercer's bedroom, the sheets were folded so precisely they seemed untouched, but the pillow was split down the center, stuffing pulled out in a perfect line, as if something sharp, or someone unfamiliar with human habits, had examined it. In Eloise Carver's home, all the candles were melted down to stubs despite the wicks never having been lit. And in Thomas Renly's cabin, the sheriff found a single footprint, shallow, weightless, yet perfectly defined, pressed into the wooden floorboards as though left by something that neither weighed nor touched, but merely passed through. Rumors grew like weeds. Some villagers swore they saw gold glinting between the trees at dusk. Others claimed they heard faint music, violins, slow and mournful, drifting through the fog at midnight. A group of young men insisted that one night, standing on the ridge overlooking Hallow Creek, they saw 12 figures circling the town, their gold masks catching the moonlight like mirrors reflecting something far above the sky. But the most disturbing rumor came from Abigail Old Abby Marlin, the eccentric widow who lived on the far edge of the woods. Abby claimed she had seen the masked figures before, not just during the procession, but decades earlier, as a child. Her voice shook as she recounted the memory. She had woken one night to the sound of bells, soft and delicate, drifting through her window. When she peered outside, she saw a procession of gold-masked figures moving through the orchard, gliding across the grass without leaving footprints. They stopped beneath a willow tree and lifted a young man, someone she didn't recognize, into their arms. Then, with a flash of gold, the figures and the man vanished into the darkness as though swallowed by the night. Abby had kept the memory buried, convinced it was a childhood hallucination until the guilt procession returned. Her story, the first account of a prior appearance, spread through the town like wildfire, shattering whatever fragile sense of calm remained. If the procession had come before, it could come again. And if it came again, what would it want this time? The fear worsened when letters began appearing on doorsteps exactly 14 days after the procession. Each letter was identical. No name, no signature, no ink difference. Just the same split mask emblem stamped in gold wax and a single line beneath it. One debt remains unpaid. Panic erupted. Families fled into the woods, but many returned in terror, claiming the forest didn't want them to leave. Some simply walked back silently, numb with fear, numb with fear. Others returned with scratches carved into their arms, shapes resembling the same split mask. Sheriff Ward demanded everyone bring their letters to the chapel for examination. But something strange happened as the townspeople gathered. The letters began to hum, not loudly, just a faint vibration, like a swarm of bees trapped inside the parchment. Children cried. Men dropped the letters. The chapel candles flickered violently, bending as though pushed by an unseen wind. And then just as suddenly as the humming began, it stopped. When they lifted the letters again, the gold wax seals had melted into perfect circles, erasing the emblem completely. That night, the mayor found something even more disturbing. A set of golden footprints leading up to his doorstep, prints that began at the edge of the square, crossed the frost-covered road, and stopped exactly 1 inch before his door. They glittered faintly in the moonlight, glowing like embers trapped beneath ice. When the mayor touched one, it wasn't cold like the air. It was warm. Unnaturally warm. As if something living had stood there just moments before. Hallow Creek no longer wondered if the procession would return. They wondered when, and more importantly, who would be taken next. The mayor did not sleep the night. He found the warm, golden footprints outside his home. Instead, he sat upright in his study with every candle lit, clutching a rusted pistol that hadn't been fired since his youth, flinching at every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the winter wind. Wind, winter wind. By morning, he looked 20 years older, his eyes sunken and unfocused, and yet he refused to speak a word about what he had felt in those footprints, the unmistakable heat of something alive. something watching him. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek descended further into paranoia. The butcher boarded up his windows and refused customers. Children were forbidden to play outside. The church bell tolled twice every night, despite no one being there to pull the rope. And as rumors thickened like a fog around the town, a discovery made by young Peter Caldwell changed everything. While cutting through the old cemetery on his way home, a shortcut he usually took without fear, he noticed that the mausoleum at the far end, the one belonging to the long-dead Aldridge family, had its iron gates slightly ajar. Everyone knew the Aldridge mausoleum had been sealed with iron rivets 20 years earlier after vandals broke in, and those rivets had never been removed. Yet there it was, open, barely, just enough for someone, or something, to slip through. Against his better judgment, Peter approached. Inside, the air felt wrong, unmoving, too cold, too still, dust hung thick like it had weight. But what stopped him in his tracks was not the silence, not the cold, but the footprints, small indentations leading directly from the entrance toward the last crypt on the right. They were golden. Not metallic dust, not mineral flecks, actual faintly glowing prints pressed into the stone floor, shimmering like molten gold cooling after being poured. Peter followed them to the crypt of Elias Aldridge, a man whose portrait still hung in the town hall. Stern face, sunken cheeks, a gold chain around his neck. Elias Aldridge had died in 1791. Yet someone had recently removed the heavy stone lid of his coffin and placed it neatly against the wall. And inside the coffin lay something Peter would never forget. Elias Aldridge's body was still there, mostly. Clothes intact, bones undisturbed, but the skull was missing. In its place, resting neatly upon the ribcage like an offering, was a mask of pure hammered gold, identical to the ones worn by the procession, smooth, blank, empty. As Peter stared frozen in terror, he noticed faint scratch marks carved into the inside of the coffin lid. Not random, not desperate clawing, words. Letters etched by something sharp, something deliberate. Taken, Peter stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, and fled from the mausoleum faster than he had ever run in his life. He told the sheriff, who then told the mayor, and by dusk the entire town knew. Elias Aldridge had been taken, decades after his burial, and replaced with a gold mask. If the procession had been coming to Hollow Creek since the 1700s, then the masked figures weren't kidnappers. They weren't ghosts. They weren't cultists. They were something far older. Something that visited repeatedly. Something that collected. That night, as the town huddled in fear, Sheriff Ward, Father Belmore, the mayor, and a handful of desperate men met in the chapel to discuss their next step. Panic consumed the meeting. Some argued they should flee en masse. Others insisted they should fight, though no one could explain how one fights beings that float, beings that radiate heat, beings with no faces. Yangus Praises from an old lay revealed something he had never dared share, dozens of pages from an old Latin journal hidden in the chapel cellar. The ink was faded, the parchment brittle, but the message unmistakable. The entry spoke of a group called the Gilded Ones, beings described not as alive or dead, but as borrowed shapes. They did not wear masks to hide their faces. They wore masks because they had no faces to hide. Their purpose: to reclaim a faces owed, a debt established centuries ago between the Aldridge settlers and the Watchers beneath the hills. The last entry ended with a chilling warning. When the gold returns, so too does the debt. Run and they will follow. Hide and they will wait. Resist and they will take more than faces. Before anyone could process the meaning of the words, the church lanterns flickered violently, flames stretching upward as if pulled by invisible strings. A cold hum filled the chapel, vibrating the wooden pews, rattling the stained glass windows. And then outside, at the very edge of the square, all faint glimmers of gold appeared, floating, gliding, slowly moving closer. The guilt procession had returned, but this time they weren't arriving in silence. They were coming to collect their debt. When the villagers woke the next morning, the forest stood unnervingly still, as if the wind itself refused to touch the trees where the golden masked figures had stood only hours before. The ground held no footprints, no drag marks, no signs of departure, just the faint circular scorch where the masked procession had stopped, glowing like a dying ember beneath a layer of ash. Rumors spread through Eldershade like sickness, carried from doorway to doorway, that the masked ones were not human at all. that they were the original settlers of the land who had vanished in a night of fire centuries earlier. That their gold masks were not masks, but the last traces of faces melted into metal by some unholy ritual gone wrong. At the center of the panic was old Midrin Hale, the shepherd who swore he saw one of the golden figures standing outside his window just before dawn, its metal face pressed against the glass, tapping lightly with 2 fingers as if trying to remember how knocking worked. Many dismissed Midrin's claims as drunken exaggeration until they visited his home, where the window pane showed 2 long, smeared streaks in a perfect fingerprint pattern. Prints far too elongated, too thin, as though the creature had bones shaped for something not quite human. Patrols were ordered that evening, but only 3 men volunteered. 2 young blacksmith brothers, desperate to prove their courage, and a disgraced former constable who hoped redemption lay somewhere in the darkness. They carried lanterns whose flame trembled every time the trees shifted, though no breeze touched them. Villagers watched as the patrol vanished into the tree line, their lights bobbing like dying stars until they disappeared completely. For 3 hours there was only silence. Then suddenly a single lantern blinked back into view, swaying as if someone sprinted with it. A moment later, the blacksmith brothers burst from the trees, faces pale, eyes wide, mouths trembling with words they couldn't form. But the constable was not with them, and neither was his lantern. When they finally managed to speak, their voices cracked as they described hearing metal scraping against bark, footsteps approaching from all directions, though no visual form ever appeared. They said the constable had been walking ahead when something cold clamped around his wrist. When he screamed, the sound was muffled instantly as though swallowed by the forest itself. All they saw before running was a brief glint of gold moving between the trees, too fast, too smooth, almost gliding. The village elders met again, this time in complete terror, and decided to send a messenger to the nearest township at first light. But when dawn arrived, every horse in the village was found dead. No wounds, no struggle, simply collapsed as if drained of breath. Even more disturbing, each corpse bore a thin gold dusting around the muzzle, shimmering softly when touched. Panic shifted into full terror. Families barricaded themselves inside homes, placing candles at windows, whispering desperate prayers to gods no longer worshipped. And that night, when the moon rose blood orange behind the mountains, the bells of the abandoned Marrowhill Chapel began ringing on their own, slow at first, then violently. Villagers gathered in trembling clusters, watching the chapel tower sway with each eerie toll. No one dared approach, until finally the blacksmith brothers stepped forward with shaking resolve. When they pushed open the chapel doors, a gust of frigid air extinguished every candle in the village at once, plunging Eldershade into absolute darkness. Inside the chapel lay the missing constable, standing upright in the middle of the aisle, not breathing, not blinking, his body locked in place. A golden mask clung to his face, not worn, not tied, but fused to his skin like molten metal, had cooled around his skull. Behind him on every pew sat a newly formed golden mask, each crafted with impossibly precise detail, each with hollow eyes staring forward. And as the villagers approached, the masks began to tilt, ever so slightly, as if something inside them had just awakened. The constable's fused mask became the center of every whispered fear in Eldershade, for no one could explain how the gold had melted into his skin without burning the flesh, how it had hardened without any visible source of heat, or how his body remained upright long after his heart had stopped beating. As the villagers backed away from the chapel, a low hum, almost like distant chanting, vibrated through the wooden beams, growing stronger the closer anyone came to the pews, filled with those newly formed masks. Some villagers swore the masks shifted their expressions when no one watched, stretching the metallic mouths into silent screams or pulling the eye slits wider as if hungry for faces to mold themselves onto. The elders ordered the chapel sealed, nailed shut with iron bars and covered in salt, believing old rites might slow the curse that was crawling across their home like an unseen plague. But sealing the chapel did not stop what had already begun. That same night, dozens of villagers reported hearing footsteps outside their windows, slow, dragging, metallic footsteps that left faint golden streaks on the cobblestones by morning. Even more disturbing, children began waking up with strange dreams, visions of hallways filled with faceless people reaching out with shimmering hands, beckoning them to follow. The adults dismissed these as nightmares until one child, a quiet boy named Tom, disappeared from his bed without leaving a single footprint in the frost. His mother found only a thin trail of gold dust on the pillow and a small, perfectly carved mask hanging from the bedpost. Too small for any adult. Too detailed to be made by human hands overnight. Panic erupted, and the villagers fled to the town square, demanding answers, demanding escape, demanding someone be held accountable. That was when old Midran Hale, trembling and pale, stepped forward and confessed his secret. He had seen the masked ones before, decades ago, as a boy. Silent figures watching him from the edge of the forest, their gold faces gleaming even in the dark. He admitted he had been warned never to speak of them, that the masked ones returned only when the village disrupted the land where they slept. Midran's words ignited fury. Villagers screamed accusations at him, blaming him for inviting the curse, but before they could seize him, the church bells rang again. 3 long, hollow tolls that echoed unnaturally across the valley, ringing from within the sealed chapel. Every iron bar, every nail, every strip of salt trembled. The doors bulged outward as if something inside was pressing its weight against them. Then suddenly the chapel fell silent. The villagers held their breath, until the doors slowly creaked open on their own, swinging wide despite the restraint still nailed across them. The iron bars had not broken. They had simply bent, as if softened by invisible heat. Lanterns were raised, and inside stood Tom, the missing child, alive but unmoving, standing in the center of the aisle just like the constable. His face was untouched, but he stared blankly ahead, whispering words no one could understand. The masks on the pews had multiplied. Hundreds now, each one slightly different, as though each had been crafted from a different lost soul. One by one, they began to vibrate, shaking violently until they lifted an inch off the wood, hovering, rattling like teeth in a skull. Tom suddenly turned his head toward the villagers, slowly, too slowly, and in a voice that was not his own, he said, "They are not masks. They are faces returned." Before anyone could react, the masks fell silent and dropped to the pews with a soft metallic thud. Thud. Tom collapsed, unconscious, his pulse weak but present. That night, every villager realized the truth burning beneath their fear. The masked ones weren't selecting victims. They were reclaiming something that had once belonged to them, something Eldershade had stolen or disturbed long before anyone alive could remember. And whatever they were awakening, it was far from finished. As Tom lay unconscious in the chapel doorway, the villagers carried him into the town hall, desperate for answers. But the boy's breathing was shallow, and each exhale released a faint shimmer like dust catching candlelight. The village healer, Agnes Breyer, examined him and recoiled when she found that the inside of his throat glimmered faintly with gold, as if something metallic had brushed against his voice. She whispered that this was not illness, this was transformation, a process halted halfway. The villagers argued, terrified and frantic, until the room's candles suddenly flickered, their flames bending unnaturally toward the west wall, toward the sealed archives where the oldest records of Eldershade were stored. At first no one noticed, but then a low, rhythmic tapping began from inside that archive room. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps again, the same cadence as the chapel bells. Constable Rowan, one of the few unmasked men left, approached cautiously, his hand trembling as he pressed his ear to the wooden door. His eyes widened. "Someone is inside," he whispered, though no one had entered that locked room in years. The villagers broke the lock, expecting to find a desperate survivor. But what greeted them was far worse. The room was completely empty, yet thick footprints made of tarnished gold led in a slow circle around the shelves. Stopping in front of a single leather-bound ledger resting open on the floor, as though an invisible figure had been reading it moments before. Agnes picked up the ledger, brushing away a dusting of gold granules. It was dated 1631, nearly 2 centuries old, and written in a script none of them recognized. The elders gathered around, and as they studied the brittle pages, a chilling silence fell. The ledger spoke of the founding hunger, a winter so brutal it decimated the original settlers, driving them into a pact with beings they referred to only as other gilded. These beings, described as wandering spirits or ancestral guardians, had offered protection and survival, but at a cost. To seal the pact, 12 settlers had carved ceremonial masks of gold and worn them during a night ritual deep in the forest, a ritual meant to bind the village's fate to the land itself. According to the ledger, those who wore the masks surrendered their identities willingly, allowing the Gilded to preserve their essence for future generations. But the pact was never meant to be broken. The ledger's final entry, written in a frantic hand, claimed that the masks were not artifacts. They were vessels, containers holding the consciousness of the original 12. And every century, the Gilded would awaken, seeking faces to replace their own, reclaiming the debt owed to them. Rowan's voice shook as he read aloud. When the 12th face is taken, the golden return begins. A cold dread settled over the room as everyone counted the missing. 12 people had vanished or been claimed by the mask since the curse resurfaced. That number could not be coincidence. Before anyone could speak, Tom suddenly gasped awake, sitting upright as if pulled by invisible strings. The shimmer in his breath intensified, and his eyes, once brown, now gleamed with a faint metallic sheen. He stared at the villagers, but his expression was no longer that of a terrified child. It was ancient, knowing, unbearably calm. When he spoke, his voice carried an echo, as though layered with another voice beneath his own. "The debt is paid," he whispered, "but the return is only the beginning." Panic erupted. Some villagers fled the hall, others backed away from Tom in horror. Rowan reached for the boy, trying to shake him back to himself, but Tom raised a hand, not violently, but slowly, and Rowan froze, unable to move. Gold dust rose from Tom's fingertips, swirling in the air like sparks drifting upward from a fire. The village healer cried out for help, but no one dared approach. Tom looked at the open ledger, then at the terrified villagers, and spoke with a quiet finality that chilled every soul present. "You were never meant to forget us. You were meant to become us." And then the candles all went out at once. Darkness swallowed the room. And in that perfect darkness, dozens of metallic footsteps began to circle them. Slow, deliberate, patient. When the candles finally sputtered back to life, relighting not by human hands but as if some unseen breath had passed over them, the villagers found themselves no longer standing in the town hall as they remembered it. The wooden walls had warped into old, uneven stone, as if the building had aged centuries in a few seconds, and the air smelled of damp soil, rusted metal, and something sweetly rotting beneath. Tom was gone, vanished from the center of the room, but golden footprints now led from where he had sat to the far corner, disappearing beneath a section of wall that had not existed moments before. Rowan, still trembling from whatever unseen force had held him frozen, staggered backward, his voice cracking as he whispered that the room had shifted to mirror the architecture described in the oldest pages of the ledger, a structure that had once served as the first settlers' ceremonial vault. Agnes knelt to examine the floor, running her fingers over the glowing prints, and flinched when they burned her skin with a soft hiss. She jerked away, horrified, and whispered that the footprints didn't just glow. They pulsed like something alive. Before anyone could respond, a deep vibration rolled under their feet, followed by a hollow creaking sound like metal being bent from the inside. The villagers backed away as the section of the wall with the disappearing footprints began to bulge outward, as though something or someone on the other side was pushing to come through. Every candle trembled again, flames bending toward the wall like they were bowing. Rowan lifted a discarded chair to defend himself, but the wood crumbled in his hands to gray dust. Even the objects in the room seemed to recognize that they stood at the threshold of something ancient and unstoppable. Slowly, the bulging stone split apart, revealing a narrow passageway descending into complete darkness. It was carved of the same rough, ancient stone, lined with faint etchings that glimmered gold whenever the candlelight touched them. But the most terrifying detail wasn't the staircase itself. It was the dozen figures standing at the bottom, unmoving, half-shrouded in shadows. They weren't fully visible, but the faint glint of metallic masks caught the light. 12 masks, 12 missing villagers. An awful silence settled over everyone as the figures lifted their heads in perfect unison. A low, rhythmic hum began to rise from the passageway, vibrating through the floor, through the villagers' bones, through their teeth, as if the entire structure had become an instrument. Agnes gasped suddenly, clutching her chest, whispering that the hum matched the sound she had heard once before, when she was a child and watched her grandmother die wearing a strange expression of relief and terror. Rowan, fighting every instinct to flee, stepped closer to the passage, forcing himself to speak, demanding Tom's whereabouts and shouting that the dead had no right to claim the living. The humming intensified in response, and the 12 masked figures took one synchronized step upward. Their movements were unnatural, fluid yet jerky, too controlled as if guided by a puppeteer. The golden masks reflected the candlelight eerily, making it impossible to tell whether there were human faces behind them or only hollow darkness. Then a soft whisper drifted up the stairs, echoing around them. The 13th must return. The villagers froze. The ledger had spoken of 12 original settlers who surrendered their identities, but no mention had ever been made of a 13th. Agnes frantically flipped through the old pages, her hands shaking as she found a torn section near the end where an entire paragraph had been removed. She traced the ripped fibers with a trembling finger and whispered that someone had intentionally removed the record of a final participant, someone whose role was essential. As they pieced together the fragmented clues, Rowan's breath caught when he remembered the shimmering dust left behind when Tom awoke. The way his voice had carried an echo, the way he spoke as though possessed by an older intelligence. Tom was not taken. He was chosen. Tom was the 13th. And the pact that had begun centuries ago could only be completed with his full surrender. The masked figures continued their slow ascent, one step pause, moving with a ritualistic precision that made every villager's heartbeat sync unwillingly with their rhythm. Rowan backed away, pulling Agnes with him, whispering that they had to seal the passage, destroy the masks, break the pact. Anything to prevent whatever waited at the bottom of that dark staircase from emerging fully into their world. But before they could move, the humming stopped. Silence crushed the air, and from the darkness below, Tom's voice rose, calm, cold, ancient, saying, "You cannot break what you became the day you built this village." And the 12 masked figures reached the final step. The moment the 12 masked figures stepped fully into the hall, the temperature dropped so sharply that every villager exhaled white fog, as if winter itself had been dragged upward from the earth. The masks gleamed brighter now, catching the candlelight in a way that made them look almost molten, as though heat radiated from within, despite the freezing air around them. The figures did not speak, yet an unmistakable pressure settled on every mind in the room, an awareness, a presence, ancient and collective, probing silently, weighing each soul like a butcher judging cuts of meat. Rowan instinctively stepped in front of Agnes and the others, but the masked figures didn't even acknowledge him. Their attention seemed to flow past the living, searching for someone else. And then, from the darkness of the staircase, Tom emerged, walking calmly, barefoot, each step leaving faint gold smudges on the stone. His eyes, fully metallic now, reflected no fear, no humanity, only a mirrored emptiness that felt like staring into a well with no bottom. Behind him, the staircase walls continued to shift, expanding and contracting like a giant stone lung breathing slowly. Tom stopped beside the 12 mask wearers, and though he looked like a child, he carried himself with a solemn authority that froze everyone in place. "The 13th returns to complete the circle," he said, his voice layered with multiple tones beneath the child's. The room trembled as he spoke, dust falling from the rafters like gray snow. A sudden cracking echoed overhead as the beams twisted and groaned, but no debris fell, held in place by the same unnatural force that had rewritten the hall's architecture minutes before. Agnes, shaking but determined, stepped forward and begged Tom to fight whatever had taken hold of him, to remember who he was, who his mother was, who the village was supposed to protect. For a single flicker of a moment, Tom's metallic eyes softened, but then the masks turned toward Agnes in perfect unison, and the faint sound of low, breath-like whispers filled the air, drowning out her plea. Rowan grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back as Tom lifted a hand. The whispers swirled tighter, forming an invisible current that spiraled around the villagers, herding them into a semicircle facing the masked congregation. Tom's expression was unreadable. "You cling to identity," he said quietly. "Identity is what cursed this land. Names breed hunger. Shubi, faces breed fear. The Gilded offered unity, and your ancestors chose division instead." Rowan shouted back that the villagers had never asked to inherit a curse. For that matter, they hadn't even known it existed. His voice cracked as he demanded to know why innocent people had to pay a debt forged in secrecy centuries before. Tom tilted his head slightly, mimicking an old gesture he used to do when listening to bedtime stories, but now it looked eerie, unnatural. "Innocence is perception," Tom answered. "But debt is truth, and the truth is written in gold. With that, the masked figures each took a step forward, raising their hands. The gold on their fingertips glowed like embers. Spewed like embers. Rowan braced for an attack, but instead the masks shifted, metal rippling like liquid. As the shapes distorted, stretching, bending, forming grotesque facsimiles of human expressions. One mask began to smile too wide. Another frowned with sunken cheeks. Another seemed to cry with molten tears. It was as if the masks were trying to mimic human feelings without understanding them, twisting emotion into parody. The villagers recoiled in terror. Then something worse happened. The masks began to detach. Slowly, silently, as though unstrapped by invisible hands, each golden mask floated free from its wearer's face, rising slightly above the figures' heads. And beneath them, there was nothing. No flesh, no bone, no human remnants. Only swirling, shimmering gold dust shaped faintly like a human head, constantly shifting, falling apart and reforming like a storm trapped in a skull's outline. Agnes screamed, stumbling backward, realizing finally that the missing villagers weren't wearing masks. They had been consumed by them. The masks were the beings, the hosts were gone. The 12 golden masks hovered in the air, turning toward Tom. He stepped forward, closing his eyes, and the masks tilted as if bowing to him. Rowan moved to drag Tom away, but the golden dust inside the hollow masks suddenly surged outward like a wave, engulfing the villagers in a gust that knocked several to the ground. The candles went out again, plunging the hall into darkness, and the last thing anyone saw was Tom's face. Calm, shining faintly as the 13 masks began to circle him, forming a golden crown of spinning light. Then a single echoing whisper filled the pitch-black room, cold and final. The 13th ascends. When the darkness lifted, not by candle, not by fire, but by a faint, unnatural glow leaking from the spinning masks, the villagers found themselves no longer standing inside the hall. The walls had dissolved into a vast circular chamber carved from ancient stone, its ceiling lost in shadows, its floor etched with runes that pulsed like veins carrying molten gold beneath the surface. The transformation had been instantaneous and silent, as if reality had simply blinked and replaced their world with another. Rowan staggered, disoriented, trying to understand what had happened, but every direction looked the same. Endless stone, endless symbols, endless golden light trickling through cracks like liquid sunlight pooled underground. The 12 masks circled Tom in a slow orbit, hovering high above his head, turning and tilting like planets revolving around a sun. The boy stood at the center of the chamber, eyes closed, his face serene in the same disturbing way a statue might look serene just before it comes alive. Agnes crawled toward him, reaching out, begging him to wake up from whatever nightmare he was trapped in. But the moment her fingertips brushed the glowing boundary around him, she was flung backward by a force so powerful it knocked the breath from her lungs. Her scream echoed unnaturally, doubling and tripling in the air, as though the chamber wanted to preserve every sound made within it. Rowan dropped to her side, helping her up, but something else demanded his attention. Shapes began bleeding into existence along the chamber walls. Faces etched into the stone, emerging in slow distortion, stretching outward like clay being pushed from behind. Dozens of them. Hundreds, favorites, their mouths open in silent screams, their hollow eyes wide with eternal terror. Rowan realized with horror that these were the lost villagers from centuries of history, every person the masks had ever taken. Their souls, or echoes of them, fused into the walls like living hieroglyphs. Tom opened his eyes then. They were no longer glowing metal. Now they were pure white, blank and depthless, like the eyes of a statue or a forgotten deity. His voice echoed powerfully as he spoke, though his lips barely moved. "The Gilded are not evil," he said. "They are eternal. They preserved what your ancestors feared." Rowan shouted back that preserving was not the same as devouring, that what these masks had done to the villagers was not protection but annihilation. Tom simply raised his hand. The runes on the floor erupted in brilliance as the masked figures descended, forming a widening circle. The light grew brighter until it hurt to look, forcing the villagers to shield their eyes. When they dared open them again, the 12 swirling golden faces had begun to merge. Their edges softened, melted, joined. What had been 12 masks slowly became one massive shifting face of gold suspended above Tom, a face that flickered constantly, changing age, gender, expression, as if wearing every stolen identity at once. It whispered. Not words, just breath, a sound that carried memory. A sound older than language. The villagers around Rowan fell to their knees, some in terror, some because their legs gave out beneath the weight of that impossible presence. Rowan resisted, teeth clenched, sweat dripping down his spine, refusing to bow. Agnes grabbed his arm, voice shaking, telling him they had to stop the ritual, had to disrupt the merging before Tom was consumed completely. But how? The golden power in the room was beyond anything human, and then Rowan remembered the ledger, the torn page, the missing record of the 13th. Someone had tried to erase the ritual, not to hide it, but to prevent its completion. If the 13th was never allowed to ascend, the pact would remain incomplete. Rowan realized what he had to do, even if it meant tearing Tom from the ritual by force. He pushed forward, bracing himself against the burning energy, inching closer toward the glowing boundary around the boy. Every step felt like walking into a storm of needles. The giant golden face turned suddenly toward him, shifting into an expression of cold, ancient fury, and a deep rumble vibrated through the chamber floor as golden dust surged upward, forming a barrier. Rowan pushed through it, screaming from the heat, from the tearing sensation as the dust seared into his skin. Tom whispered, "Do not break the circle." But Rowan didn't stop. Agnes cried out, trying to reach him, but the golden dust coiled around her ankles, pulling her backward like vines. Rowan made it to the boundary, reached out his hand, and touched Tom's wrist at the exact moment the merged mask released a blinding pulse of gold. The chamber exploded with light. A roar shook the air, and Rowan felt the world rip open. When the blinding gold pulse faded, the villagers found themselves standing in a space that was neither elder shade nor the chamber beneath the hall, but something in between. Place stitched from memory and nightmare, where the floor was cobbled like the village streets. But the buildings leaned at impossible angles, and the sky was an endless twilight streaked with molten gold clouds. Rowan stumbled forward, clutching his head, trying to reconcile what had just happened. Tom stood at the center of the distorted square, no longer a child, no longer glowing. But something about him was undeniably changed. His eyes reflected every face the Gilded had taken over centuries, flickering in quick succession like shadows, dancing across molten metal. The 12 masks hovered behind him, suspended in the air, still merging and unmerging, breathing with a rhythm that felt alive. The villagers realized, in a sickening instant, that the ritual had not ended. It had transformed. Tom the 13th had become a living conduit between the mortal world and the Gilded, a bridge across time and memory. Every whisper of wind, every flicker of gold dust around the square felt purposeful, deliberate, as if the very air was now infused with consciousness, watching, judging. Rowan tried to speak, but his voice trembled under the weight of centuries, old knowledge now pressing down on him. Tom's gaze swept over them, and for a moment, the air hung still, frozen. Then, softly, he said, "You will remember, or you will join them." Fear gripped every heart. Some villagers fell to their knees, weeping, while others stumbled backward, attempting to flee into streets that shifted unnaturally beneath their feet. Every exit seemed to stretch or vanish entirely, funneling them toward the center where Tom and the masks waited. It was as if the village itself had become a mechanism, a cage designed to keep them there until the Gilded had finished what centuries of secrecy had begun. Rowan's mind raced. Could he break the cycle, sever the pact, save his people? He remembered the torn ledger, the missing passage that might hold the key. Moving quickly, he gestured for Agnes to retrieve the fragmented pages she had hidden in her coat, praying that whatever spell or ritual bound the masks could be undone. Tom's attention flicked briefly to Rowan, and in that moment, Rowan glimpsed something. Not malice, not cruelty, but inevitability. A relentless force that would not be denied. Yet the boy hesitated, an imperceptible pause that felt like a heartbeat stretched across eternity. Rowan read aloud the fragmented Latin, each word echoing strangely across the twisted square, and as the final syllable left his lips, a vibration rolled through the air, scattering the hovering gold dust and forcing the masks into spasms of distortion. The golden faces shrieked in a soundless scream, twisting as if resisting the words, struggling against the fragments of power Rowan invoked. Tom's form trembled violently, the countless faces flickering faster than ever. And then, all at once, the masks collapsed inward, spinning into a single column of molten gold that plummeted into the cobblestone floor like a spear. shattering with a deafening clang. Silence followed. The villagers, shaken and bloodied from the psychic weight of what they had endured, looked around. The village had returned, mostly intact, though scorched and warped in places, reminders of the trial they had survived. Tom, now truly himself again, fell to the ground, eyes wide with exhaustion and confusion. He was still alive. The masks were gone, or perhaps dormant, waiting centuries more for the next cycle. Rowan helped him to his feet. Agnes wrapped a trembling arm around Tom, whispering prayers of gratitude. But the knowledge remained, heavy in every mind. The Gilded Ones were eternal, and though the ritual had been disrupted, the debt of faces, the hunger, the watchful presence in the shadows, it would never fully leave Eldershade. They had survived, yes, but survival now carried a price. The constant awareness that history itself could awaken in a single night. That gold could no longer be seen as treasure, but only as the embodiment of a debt, owed and relentless, stretching across centuries. The villagers emerged from the hall into a dawn tinged with an unnatural golden glow, the air thick with whispers of memory, the world forever altered. Tom, Rowan, and Agnes knew they could never speak of the events without drawing attention, without risking the gaze of the Gilded. And somewhere beyond the hills, beneath the earth, in the folds of shadows and memory, the masks waited, silent, patient, and eternal, until the day the debt would be called again.